Welcome to the 14th episode of Kabbalistic Mystic, the podcast for the Western Seeker, where we explore the tree of life and the ancient Hebrew wisdom as the lost spiritual heritage of the West. I'm your host, Batat. This episode is dedicated to my non-Jewish friends and listeners who might wonder what it was like to grow up as a Jewish boy in an Orthodox family in Jerusalem, what Judaism is all about, who is a Jew and who's not, and why are the Jews so hated by many? That's a lot to cover in one episode, so let's begin. I grew up in Jerusalem in the 80s to a religious Orthodox family. Now, this means that when it comes to the scale of religiousness, I was somewhere in the middle. We weren't quite the black hat Jews that you see in movies. My dad wore regular clothes, and my mom did not cover her hair, and she even wore pants. But we vigilantly observed the Shabbat, the Sabbath, which is the seventh day, Saturday, and kept a strict kosher kitchen. Now, at the center of the life of every Jew, you will find the Shabbat. It's the seventh day of the week in which, according to literal translation of the Hebrew Bible, one must not work and should dedicate the holy day to rest, joyfulness, and pleasure. The idea itself is really wonderful. I can't even describe the notion of having a set day to rest, one with which most people observe, can have on the psyche. Unlike Tel Aviv, Jerusalem was and still is predominantly religious. And so when I grew up, no restaurants were open on Shabbat, no businesses, really no store, no movies, no theaters. Money exchange really was forbidden on Shabbat. So conducting business is really impossible. And public transportation was not available, which really means that somebody would have to work in order to operate it. So most people didn't even drive their cars. And so once the sun went down on Friday evening, which is when Shabbat starts, a strange and wonderful silence wrapped the city with a cloak of holiness. It was very palpable. You could really feel it in the air. And really, except for the occasional car on one of the main streets, no busy sounds would be heard. Needless to say, as a kid, I hated it. Judaism is a left-brain, highly analytical, obsessed, logical habituality in a way I can only describe an autistic linearity, if such a word exists. As such, the requirement to avoid work on Shabbat has turned into a ridiculous maze of restrictions it takes a lifetime to master. Examples. Since constructing a structure would be considered work, opening an umbrella on Shabbat was forbidden. So was carrying an object in your pocket beyond set boundaries, or turning on the light switch, because that builds an electric circuit and starts a tiny unseen fire, a spark of electricity. So that's out. This means no TV, no video games, anything battery operated, and no opening the fridge unless we remember to disable the automatic light. We couldn't even cut toilet paper on Shabbat for the reason you are really tearing an existing structure. And many times as a kid, I found myself pre-cutting toilet paper as, at the request of my mom. A special timer regulated how long we could read to the selected lights that were left on in the living room and in the kitchen. And once the kerosene ran out of the only heating stove we had, which usually happened before dawn on Saturday morning, coats and blankets were really the only way to keep warm during the cold Jerusalem winters. To me, it also meant that I couldn't communicate with my friends and, most importantly, my girlfriend. And furthermore, I had to go to synagogue with my dad, who forced me to go with him. Luckily for me, only on Friday night and Saturday mornings. And that was something I'll never understood. Shabbat was meant to rest, and yet I was forced to get up at 6:30 a.m. in the only day I didn't have to go to school and rush to the synagogue. My poor dad, I can't even begin to tell you the struggle he had getting me to get up. I was usually extremely late, making him very upset. Now, Jews pray really 3 times a day: morning, sometimes between noon and then sometimes between noon and sunset, and then once after sunset. So 3 times a day, sort of like, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, my father, luckily, was not so observant on this requirement, probably because he was working very hard to get food on the table and clothes on our backs, and just couldn't fit it in. But more observant Jews lived and still live in and out of the synagogue around the prayers which dictate the cycle of the day. Now, Judaism is a monotheistic religion like Islam, which means that at the core of it, there is a belief that there's only one God. Jews calculate the year by the moon, not by the sun, which means the year starts sometime in December around the equinox. And every few years, you have 13 months to catch up with the Gregorian sun-based calendar. Now, don't get me wrong, Judaism has many beautiful symbolic rituals, and the religion cultivates many customs which promote tribal equality, family cohesiveness, love of thy neighbor, inner spirituality. That said, to focus on these parts, I suggest you explore the religions through some liberal and unorthodox domination, which are more common in the US. The vast majority of Jews, especially in Israel, are Orthodox or Hasidic Jews, which means that the religion is a stagnated, rigid, and complex structure of rules and regulations that only the undiscriminating law of generational development will perhaps be able to untangle over the years. Now, because there are so many religious people in Israel, most established government coalitions include the powerful religious parties. And so in Israel, church and state, or should I say synagogue and state, are really not that separate. And to this day, there's no public transportation in most cities in Israel on Shabbat, and many, many other civil laws are infused and sometimes completely controlled by the rabbinical courts. Now, to understand how Judaism got to be what it is today, we have to get a brief history of how it actually formed. Let's start 3,000 years ago. It was a time of tribal separation. Ethnic groups stuck together. There was very little cross-pollination, not just in the Middle East, but all across the world. And so you have this tribal of people, the descendants of Abraham, who, according to the Hebrew Bible, was the first one to be chosen by God to carry the law and be rewarded accordingly. Now, he was promised the land of Canaan, which is what Israel is today, sort of. Abraham, who is considered in Western religion to be the father of all nations, that is what we consider the West and the Middle East today, had many offsprings. But 2 sons are specifically mentioned: Ishmael, which means hear the call of God, and Yitzchak, which means will laugh. Ishmael is considered to be the father of all Arabs nation as we know them today. And Yitzchak, Isaac, gave birth to Jacob, Yaakov, who was later renamed by God to Israel, which means the minister of God. And so Abraham's sons, Jacob's sons, the sons of Israel, believed by some to be the fathers of the 12 Jewish tribes that constitute today's Jews. Now, Jacob's sons, the sons of Israel, really, found themselves in Egypt, being slaves. Joseph, one of his sons, somehow was sold to be a slave there, and his brothers followed, and for generations they were very close to the king. And then slowly and steadily, things have shifted. Anyway, at the end, they found themselves as slaves. And it was a time when the Egyptian spiritual culture was extremely developed. When the sons of Israel escaped Egypt, they found themselves in the desert. They were landless. They had no identity. They were wandering around for 40 years in the desert, so the story tells, at the foot of Mount Sinai, where they were selected by God himself, or itself, should I say, to receive and pass on the Torah, that is, the Jewish law, in the shape of the 10 Commandments. And hence the term, the chosen people. They were chosen by God to carry and practice the Jewish law. Now, the Jewish law is not an easy one to follow. As per the example I gave earlier, a faithful Jew would tell you that this concept of being chosen is more of a burden than anything else. Jewish religion is comprised of 613 strict rules, derivatives of the Ten Commandments, which every Jew must follow for salvation to come, that is, for the Messiah to rise. Today's modern restrictions are derivatives of derivatives and derivatives of these 313 laws. Did I say derivatives already? It's an ever-expanding oceans of restrictions and traditions. So going back to the desert, after 40 years in the desert, which is enough for a whole generation to pass, the Jews come to the land of Israel, used to be Canaan, which, as you recall, God has promised to their forefathers, specifically Abraham, Yitzchak, and Jacob. And so they conquer it by sword. They sit there for years, establishing their kingdom, building their beloved temple over this, per the specific specifications given to them in the desert by Moses, and they practice their faith. However, they get a taste of their own medicine when the Romans conquer the area, and after a rebellion, their temple is destroyed. And that was around 500 BC. Now, a second rebellion causes the second temple to burn, and that was about 600 years later, around 70 AD. But this time, the Romans decided to prevent the Jews from causing more trouble, and they sent them to exile, spreading them around Europe and the Middle East, where they remained separated for 2,000 years. It's called the Jewish diaspora, and at the end of which they almost got systematically exterminated and forever extinct via the Holocaust and other pogroms around the world, specifically in Arab countries. And somehow they survived and eventually managed to establish the state of Israel to mark the end of the 2,000 years of their separation from their promised land. Now, I can't really complete this discussion about Judaism without talking about this sort of overview about Judaism without talking about the prophecy. An interesting thing that is the chain of events I just described was played one-to-one according to this ancient prophecy told by prophets such as Ezekiel and the prophets listed in the New Testament and even in the Quran. The prophecies not only tell us what happens over the last 2,000 years, that is the Jewish diaspora, but continues to tell us what is still yet to come. That once the 2,000 years of exile will end, there will be a war like no other, the war of Gog and Magog, which will start from the north and will almost extinct the entire human race. The Messiah will then rise, riding a donkey into the city of Jerusalem, bringing with him world peace and prosperity to all nations around the world. The third temple will then be built, and happy ending will come to all. Now, the Messiah is a very important piece of the puzzle here, so let's focus on it for a moment. The Messiah is the Jewish equivalence of the resurrection of Christ, or the events of the last day in Islam. Every religion, of course, flavors the dish according to their own taste, or to their own palate, right? In Christianity, for example, it will be Jesus who will return. The righteous men will be resurrected, and the wicked will perish. According to Islam, both the wicked and the righteous will be resurrected, and the Muslim version of Jesus will descend to the world and convert everyone to Islam. He will kill the Jews, break all crosses, declare itself Muslim, and will get married. Now, good times for all, sounds like. Well, except for the Jews. Well, maybe, because they'll be killed. Now, the Jewish version, as we mentioned, is that the Messiah will be bringing with him world peace and prosperity to all nations around the world. That is, of course, is dependent on the Jews carrying out their duty of observing the law to a T, or else the Messiah is not coming. In other words, the Jews are to be the savior of the world, of the modern world, by the mere fact they observe the Jewish law. They, and they only, are required to do it because they're Jews. Talk about a load to carry. A lot of responsibility. No wonder Jews are often depicted hunched, moaning and groaning old souls. Someone once told me You Jews like to suffer. And I say, wouldn't you, knowing that this suffering is sacred duty, which will result in world peace and global prosperity? I'm joking, of course, but let's talk about how one becomes the barrier, the carrier of this dubious privilege, or what does it mean to be a Jew? So, what makes someone a Jew? Usually, when I pose this question to my non-Jewish friends, the answer I get is, well, I guess if you practice Judaism, you're a Jew. If you practice Christianity, you're a Christian, right? If you practice Islam, you're a Muslim. But in reality, it's not quite simple. By Jewish law, you're only a Jew if your mother was a Jew. That is, your blood must be Jewish. You can be a non-believing, non-practicing Jew, but you're still a Jew. In other words, Judaism is a race or an ethnic group. It has nothing to do with whether you're religious, observing the law or not. I didn't choose to be a Jew. I was born one. Being an Israeli, I was also an Israeli. Being an Israeli has nothing to do with being a Jew. Israel is a nationality, and you can be an Arab Israeli or a Christian Israeli. Judaism has to do with your blood. I am considered a Jew, and yet I do not practice the Jewish religion. And according to standard definition, there is nothing I can do to become non-Jewish. I can't un-Jew. Same goes for the one who wants to convert to Judaism. They can become a convert following a grueling religious process, but they will always be a convert Jew. In fact, it is said that it takes 10 generations for their blood to become completely Jewish. And that's why Jews don't marry outside of their own, to preserve the purity of the ethnic group. And so Judaism is really a religion, but it's also an ethnic group. And the two are somewhat intertwined. Here's an interesting fact. The State of Israel is the only country in the world that automatically grants citizenship to those who are of a direct bloodline of a particular ethnicity. That is, if you're a Jew. There's a whole organization in Israel dedicated to the research of family trees to ensure that non-Jews do not slip through the crack. In a diligent, no less zealous than the Nazis have demonstrated in determining who was to be exterminated. Determining someone's right to citizenship based on their blood is quite a racist concept, some would say, especially coming from a group of people who were systematically persecuted and killed for being of this bloodline to begin with. But this, however, is the nature of divisiveness. It breeds more separation and more hatred. We have to remember the circumstances around which the State of Israel was established. It was 1948, and only 3 years after the Holocaust ended. Many of the founders have barely escaped the Nazi death machine. The very same thread that has caused their suffering has now become the thread of hope for their future. The idea was that only when there will be a country that was created by Jews, for Jews, our people will be safe. Never again, never again, never again. That was the motto for the creation of Israel. Never again will allow anybody to do what they did to us in the Holocaust. And so the State of Israel was established. But two wrongs don't make a right, and one might claim that the idea has backfired. Separation divides and always leads to hatred, and Jews are not safe today in Israel. They must defend themselves from a plethora of Arab countries who vowed to eliminate the tiny state and fight against inner threats in the shape of its non-Jewish inhabitants, the Palestinians, for example, and in many cases, even the Arab Israelis who turn against their fellow citizens. And really, who can blame them? They are residents in a country who prides itself of being the Jewish state. In other words, if you're an Arab Israeli, you are by definition a second-class citizen. The country was not created for you. You're just there to do grandfathered rights. And I can only imagine that's not a pleasant situation to be in. It's very easy to dismiss the current state of affairs in the Middle East as political. But I do, however, believe that the issue is in its core a religious one. When one investigates the social political landscape of the conflict, one sees that the groups who do most of the fighting and advocate violence and hatred are predominantly religious. In fact, the right-wing political landscape is predominantly religious on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. And that's true in the West too, even in America. There's a direct correlation between right-wing politics and religious beliefs. In other words, the heart of the conflict in the Middle East is related to faith. I believe wholeheartedly that understanding how Judaism came to be what it is and changing our perspective on what it should mean can heal some of the wounds and bridge many of the gaps that are causing the conflict today. Same goes for Islam and Christianity. I will, however, focus on Judaism for obvious reasons. And let me give an example with a personal story, because I think that the micro is a reflection of the macro. There is a member of my immediate family who for a long time did not speak to me because I married a non-Jew to be my wife. A sin in Judaism, significant enough for this member to shun me from their lives, short only declaring me dead. In fact, I was told that a rabbi has recommended that member to declare me dead, to sit Shiva on me, which is the Jewish custom for mourning the dead. Now, when I asked that member what, in their opinion, was the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew, I wanted to know, I was like, you don't even know my wife. What is the difference between the Jew and the non-Jew? That member answered me that Jews have a different soul. And this answer, it really mirrored what I was taught in my own Orthodox high school. According to Kabbalah, there are 4 worlds in the creation, and the higher the world, the closer you are to the Creator. And the world in which you and I live right now is called the world of Asiyah, the world of action, is the lowest one. And in it, most souls originate. Now, it's believed that the soul of a Jew originates in the highest world called Atzilut, emanation. Now, I just want to be fair for a second to my fellow Jews. I'm really yet to meet an ethnic group that does not believe that it is better somehow than others. It's the self-preserving nature of humans to think that we're better than others. This belief allows us to preserve our heritage. It's only in the late 20th century, with globalization, that the idea of one race, we're all equal, has been bubbling. Class and inequality have been the undercurrent, the framework under which society has been functioning for thousands of years. And while quickly dissolving, it is still predominant in many parts of the world, both in the micro, many layers of social groups, such as Ashkenaz versus Sephardic Jews, or various class levels within, say, Britain, and in the macro, between various global ethnicities. I mean, ask a British man if he prefers to be French. See what he or she will ask. Ask any American if he prefers to be European. Ask a Scottish if he will prefer to be a British. The answer will generally be no. As a generalization, the average human carries an innate perception that he or she is of a better origin than other social or ethnic groups. And Jews are no different. So as I'm describing this, perceptions that Jews have about their origin or the origin of their soul, it's the same as any other ethnic group. But for Jews, however, this divisiveness is rooted in religion and now solidified in the land of the law, that is, in the constitution of the state of Israel, which characterizes itself as a country created for this particular ethnicity. And as such, it's preventing Israel from participating in the inevitable process of globalization and harmonization that the developed world is going through, and is the cause of much of the current suffering of the Jewish people. For example, Israel could not have participated in the European Union due to that same reason, because then it would have to allow people who are not Jewish to become citizens. At the heart of every spiritual system known to man, we find three uniting principles. The first one is that there's a single creator. The second one is that all beings created by that creator are a part of the same cosmic consciousness. That is, we're all one. And the third one is that love, not as a state of consciousness, but as a state of being, is the core of who we are and is the most powerful as well as abundantly and immediately available force that the Creator has given us. Now, beyond these three principles, when it comes to where religions go, all hell breaks loose, figuratively and sometimes literally. What does it mean that we're all one? How does that help the homeless or the one who's persecuted? What good is love when all we can find in our hearts is fear, rage, hatred? Do we need to worship this creator? How do we do it? Should we fear it? What are we allowed to do in its name? What do we need to do for it to give us what we want? And most importantly, why are we here? What is the meaning of life and what is our purpose? That is how an organized religion is formed. It starts as a simple, innocent effort to preserve and capture the knowledge of the initiate, the one who made it, the one who got enlightened. Hard rules are put in place in order to ensure the knowledge is not lost. These rules morph, transform, and slowly shape to serve the few and control the many. Some deliberately, some by evangelical fear of doing the wrong thing. God is being anthropomorphized, giving human qualities. He, and it's usually considered to be masculine, cares about what you do and keeps a tab on your sins and acts as good and acts of goodness. He punishes, he rewards. And when a spiritual framework allows itself to be shaped by fear, a religion is born. Judaism is no different. The sophistication of the Hebrew alphabet cannot be conveyed in intellectual terms. It must be perceived experientially. Once exposed to the naked brilliancy of it, one faces a trap. The cosmic map is often confused with the territory, and the odd seeker often dives into endless cycle of research in an attempt to get a deeper proof of the language's divine origin. And so Jewish texts are full with endless pages of such what my wife calls mental masturbation, if to use a crude term, a never-ending chatter focusing on numerological patterns, hidden metaphors, symbolism, and other ways in which the secrets of the Torah, that is the Hebrew word for the Old Testament, can be interpreted. Unfortunately, very few of these books have a practical day-to-day use in our modern challenging reality. Very little of the amazingly practical plethora of information hidden in the Torah finds its way to the average observing Jew, who, like most humans, struggles daily within the torturing confinements of the self-constructed image, that is, the ego personality. In reality, the Torah, the Jewish law, is a giant metaphor for the process of illumination. The Hebrew letters are as well. It hides treasures of infinite value to any willing, inquisitive, and unattached seeker. The Torah metaphorically outlines a detailed blueprint of human consciousness called the Tree of Life. On the physical plane, this map can be used as a path to self-development, to slowly and steadily deconstruct the ego personality towards a sense of purpose and inner peace. It contains information about the human body, explaining the direct correlation between the various parts and the condition of the physical vessel that houses our soul, the body. It points our location on the journey of self-realization, allowing us to physically heal ourselves as we expose our very own true nature. To the adept, the Torah offers signposts and clues on the way to awakening, all the way back to the Creator itself that is hiding within, complete spiritual enlightenment. And to humanity, the Torah sheds a revealing light on the origin, nature, and unlimited potential of human consciousness. Now, there's a glaring gap between these invaluable concepts and the actual practical use of the Torah in Jewish daily lives. It's also understandable why this gap exists. The Torah can be likened to, let's say, a sophisticated, powerful instruction manual for the secrets of the cosmos, safely kept by the Jewish people over 2,000 years. When you're keeping a manual like that as your heritage, especially since you do not understand it, you have to keep it word by word, because you don't know what you're allowed to lose and what you're not allowed to lose. And so one of the laws in Judaism is that every word, every letter in the Torah is equally important and cannot be ignored or omitted. And that sort of ensured that these texts did not change, mostly did not change for thousands of years, which is a huge, amazing accomplishment. I mean, at times, and due to persecutions, the knowledge had to pass orally from one generation to the next, testing the resilience of these remarkable people to carry their mission in the face of calamity. This instruction manual for the cosmos metaphorically is reflected in the Jewish law, unfortunately, over time solidified into the 613 hard rules of conduct. And to eliminate any loss or distortion of these instructions, Jewish law prevents and prohibits any deviation from their original literal interpretation. In other words, no laws can be added, can be changed or subtracted from. Only new child laws can be added on top of the existing ones. And the result implication of this fact is that the rules cannot change was the creation of this, as I said before, this stagnant, rigid religion that struggles to adapt to modern life. And yet at the same time, and unknowingly, this is what preserved the originality of these sacred instructions by its very confining nature. Passionately protected by some and feverishly persecuted by others, the Jews continue to serve their purpose as guardians of the knowledge until someone will come and relieve them from this burden. And this person, they believe, will do so by deciphering the manual to its full practical cosmic cues, safely passing it to all humanity to enjoy in the form of world peace, as well as the physical, intellectual, and spiritual prosperity. Now, passing that knowledge, again, is not enough intellectually, like I'm doing right now, but rather has to be exercised experientially to a situation of full enlightenment. And this individual is referred to as the Messiah, and according to Jewish prophecy, is due to incarnate within the next 200 years. So we are within the time frame that is supposed to happen. There's a whole organization in Judaism called Chabad, that which stands for Chokhmah, Binah, and Dat, the three top spheres in the Tree of Life. And that organization was formed by the rabbi from Lubavitch, the rabbi is being called. And the entire purpose of the organization was to bring the Messiah. And they believe that they're going to bring the Messiah by exercising love and happiness. And he said, when he died, he said, I failed. I obviously didn't bring the Messiah. He thought that by aligning thousands and thousands of Jews and do particular rituals in a particular way, he's going to be able to do it because according to the prophecy, this is the time. But obviously that did not happen. Now, the secret map of human consciousness evolution, this secret map of the cosmos that is hidden in the Hebrew letters and in the Torah, in the Hebrew law, as detailed as it may be, is really nothing but an intellectual mind play for those who are unwilling to travel into the realms of the heart. That's why I always say that the first step is always the dissolution of the ego. It's not enough for us to know that love exists. We must feel it to know that we are in love with someone. The same goes for the tree of life. It cannot be understood only by the intellect. It must be experienced as well. And the learning experience, joined by the intellectual grasping, results in the deep knowing that we feel in our hearts. And I think this is one of the issues with Judaism, that there's heavy focus on intellectual learning, but experiential understanding of the material is often deeply lacking. And what is that truth that we need to feel in our hearts? The real question is not what true do we need to know, but who do we need to know? And the Hebrew letters are an elaborated map to the inner realms of our souls, allowing us to know our true nature. They guide us to one single truth, an ultimate knowing that we are the Creator itself. They tell us that underneath this structured personality, we are all connected to the cosmic consciousness. In fact, we are consciousness itself, and nothing but consciousness. We're like a leaf, a single leaf on an infinite holographic tree. We are a veiled portion of creation, thinking itself into individualization, illusory existence. The Hebrew letters tell us that the reason why we're veiled, and that's our human bodies are really nothing but vessels for what we truly are, an ever-evolving, infinitely unique manifestation of cosmic consciousness we call soul. They tell us that the soul never dies, even when our physical vehicle has long ceased to exist. The letters reveal that the body is a tool of infinite potential and teach us how to transform it. They tell us that the ego personality is the first barrier to harnessing that potential and teach us how to dissolve it, awakening us to our true nature, the Creator within. And when we look at Judaism and Jewish texts with this philosophy in mind, filtering out the dogmatic, stagnated rules which make no sense, we start seeing a complete different picture. Shabbat, for example, is not about whether you're allowed to turn on a light or not. It's a metaphor for the end of the spiritual journey, the union of the masculine and the feminine, the drop of the veil between the consciousness and the subconscious mind. The Song of Songs is nothing but a metaphor for this sexual union of the masculine and feminine, which sages throughout history described as physically, sexually orgasmic. It is the seventh day to metaphorically depict the seventh density or dimension in which the work, quote unquote, is done. You're back with the Creator at that point. Saying goes to the seventh chakra or a violet energy center. It cannot be worked on. It's an aggregate of all other energy centers. The Shabbat is a reminder for all of us that what this process is about. The God of the Jews is described as vengeful and mean. And in reality, this is, again, a metaphor for the law of karma, which does not discriminate, and the fact that as long as we surrender to the appetites of the body, we will continue to suffer. It's my hope that more and more Jews, Christians, and Arabs will be able to understand that this metaphor is in the heart of their religions. In reality, we're all staring at the same hazy instruction manual, trying to figure out what it means, and in the process, following thousands of dogmatic rules that make absolutely no sense. People are killed, abused, suppressed, silenced daily due to the false interpretation of the scriptures. The key is to understand the seed and destination. And that, my friends, take a lot more courage than following rules. To do that, to understand the seed of all these religions, we must not only allow our egos to dissolve, but also allow the collective ego of us as religious Jews or religious Christians or religious Muslims to fade away into the dark pages of human history. Thank you for listening to the 14th episode of Kabbalistic Mystic. I was back from vacation during this episode, so I thank you for those of you who waited for this episode for a while. And I hope to continue over the next few weeks and months uninterrupted. I do have one trip to Israel at the end of September and in October, and I hope not to miss any episode, but we'll see how that goes. Today we discuss Judaism and how it formed to be what it is today. If you think others can benefit or enjoy this information, please share Kabbalistic Mystic with others or review it on iTunes. Reviews are very important for podcasters and will help me sustain the show. Go to kabbalisticmystic.com/review or click podcast and then review on iTunes from the top menu for simple instructions. I also want to remind you that you too can submit questions to be answered on the show via the website or the Facebook page. This concludes our time today. I'm your host, Batat from Spokane, Washington, wishing you love at every moment.